Hi, everybody. Welcome to our discussion of First Cow. I am very happy, as always, to be joined by Jennifer Fleeger, who is joining us from an undisclosed location that is very peaceful and rural, as long as she doesn't take liberties with someone else's cow. But we should have an interesting discussion of a film that I hope you all found as engaging and interesting as I did. Just a little bit of business first, though. Please keep your audio on mute until or unless I call on you. I will know to call on you because you can raise your hand within Zoom using the raise hand function. I will try to get to everybody at least once. Though if you have second or third comments, I may not be able to get to you depending on how we're running. We'd also love for you to introduce yourself in the Zoom chat window. We are joined, surprisingly, by people from all over the country and all over the world. I actually got an email from someone from Australia the other day who found our library and has been watching our past discussions. So if you are someone who's joining us from outside the greater Philadelphia area, please say hi in the chat. And if you're so inclined, please visit the Where in the World page in the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org and write a bit of a longer message. We would love to hear from you and know how you found us and how you think we're doing. And with that, I think we are ready to get started. I see we have some of our regulars raring to go. David, would you like to start us off?
I would definitely like to. Jennifer, this was, again, your choices range from really, really good to superb. I enjoyed watching this, and Janice and I felt rather than any kind of motion or any really strong activity, we were watching a study of the times and the place and the people. And that's a pretty enjoyable journey with the cinematography that was on view here. I would like to sort of get the two of you to comment a little bit about the thought process on the ending. Clearly, we knew from the opening that there was going to be some type of death scene, but we were left with, at least I was left with, a fair amount of unanswered questions. Who is the gentleman, the young man who was tracking them with the rifle? I think he showed up at the big house first. Sort of didn't get as much of a study of him, and felt like it might have been either I missed something that Kelly Reichardt was trying to teach me or show me, or she just wanted to leave me up in the air. But I thought that was a good place to give you some more thought. Again, all of your selections are really enjoyable, and they always expand our horizons. So thank you.
Thanks for those comments, David. Jennifer, would you like to start off?
I think your use of the word study is absolutely perfect. It's a study of the time and place, as you put it, but I think it's also a study of human behavior. When we see them doing their chores or how they relate to one another, and the camera is so still, we're really able to see human connection and what friendship might mean. And because of their acting ability, that's amplified as well. About the ending, I completely agree that we should talk about it more. And I bet more people on the call have some ideas about what it means. I think the gentleman that we assume actually killed the two men was aggrieved near the beginning about not being able to get one of the oily cakes in line. And so to me, what I see, at least in this contemporary moment, and I don't know if this is what Reichardt meant, is this kind of aggrieved man who hasn't found his place in society and then lashes out. And to put it mildly, we see that from time to time today.
Yeah, we do see that man early on. I think it's the first time that they have a very long line for their cakes, and an older man steps in front of him to get the last cake. And King doesn't honor the younger man's first place in line. He just gives it to the guy who steps in front, and the camera sort of lingers on that younger man, and we see his frustration. We then do see him later as somewhere on the grounds, in a cabin or in a room, in the estate where the cow is. And so the sense is he's one of the sort of, lackeys or henchmen or foot soldiers of that wealthy landowner or the governor. And I think part of the reason it's him, specifically who does it is, if we agree this movie is about, at least in part, the haves and the have-nots, and who controls things and who has the right to have things, and access and social strata and social mobility and all that, you could imagine that a henchman would sort of approach the job sort of half-heartedly, kind of the way we see the men do who go to King's cabin and destroy it. They do what they have to do, but their hearts don't quite seem in it. But because this young man has been personally offended or aggrieved by these two, I think it makes the worst outcome more likely. I think that's why it has to be him. Joss, do you have a question or comment?
Yes. First of all, I want to thank Jennifer for recommending this film. I have not seen any of Kelly Reichardt's other work, not familiar with it at all. This was just a delightful film. There was a gentleness to it. The relationship of these two men was warm and endearing, and just loved watching them interact. In your introduction, you highlighted or posed the question of what was the significance of the cow. And I think that can be interpreted many ways, but what came to mind for me was the cow as a domesticated animal, and this being the first, for one of the early encroachments of civilization in this wild place, which before that was a sort of hunter-gatherer society. In fact, King Lu said somewhere in there, history isn't here yet. And the advent of domestication and agriculture is sort of a hallmark of the beginning of history. So that's what part of what the cow meant to me. I'm sure there's much more that can be said about the cow. Another question that Jennifer raised was other films that it might have brought to mind. And the first thing that came to my mind was McCabe and Mrs. Miller. To a great extent because of the setting, because of its sort of revisionist approach to the Western genre. The characters there were not the typical Western hero. And so that came to mind. And two other small points. In McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Rene Auberjonois had a featured role, and he appeared in this film as well, very briefly, in what I think was his last film role. And one other little thing, a little jokey thing, I guess, and maybe you can enlighten us about this. When King Lu was negotiating for a ride with the canoe, he and the native greeted each other with l'chaim. I just wondered if anybody had any thoughts about that. Anyway, thanks again. This was a wonderful film, and I can't wait to see some others.
Thanks, Joss. Yeah, it sure sounded like l'chaim to me, but I thought I just must be, if everything looks like a nail to a hammer. So I just thought, anything that remotely sounds like l'chaim.
It came up that way on the subtitles.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. That clarifies it. That's very interesting. Very interesting. And Figowitz wasn't even there to benefit from it. Jennifer, did you have any thoughts on Joss's range of comments?
I think that you're absolutely right about the cow representing a different way of life or a domesticated way of life. I think one of the most beautiful things about the film is that she is not explicitly stating that that would be a better way of life. And that's what makes it interesting as a Western. We're looking at what she does, I think, in this film and in others too, is to give the Indigenous community a kind of voice, even in that scene that you just brought up, a sense of that this way of living together with nature is acceptable and in some ways preferable to the kind of way of living with nature that Chief Factor wants to do, which is to bring an animal that doesn't belong in this community here and try to create a new way of life in this environment. And so when King Liu says what you quoted, history isn't here yet, I think it's almost like a question to us. What is history? Is it things that have been written down by a certain group of people with a certain mindset, or is it just the stuff that happened? And I think he clearly means it's a kind of movement forward, a progressive way of life that we would all recognize as making a mark on the world. But I don't know that she's suggesting in the film that that is a positive thing necessarily. And that's why the cow gives us this kind of dual way of thinking. But it's a great comment.
Kathleen, you have a question or comment?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for suggesting the movie. I hesitate to use the word enjoyed, but I thought it was a really good experience to watch the movie. I was very entranced by the color palette that the filmmaker used. She picked up the teals from the forest, and she seemed to pull those into the clothes that some of the men wore, the blankets that they sat on, so that even when they were in the town, which was, not all that great at that time, the colors of the forest seemed to be part of them. Could you say anything about that?
Jennifer, can you say anything about that?
I think you just did. That was fantastic what you just said about it. It's as if nature persists on the men, even as they're trying to civilize this town, right? It's impossible to escape from the rain, from the ferns, from the mud. And we have a lot of close-up shots of boots and things that look dirty all the time on them. And so what you're saying is that, to me anyway, what I heard you saying is that Reich art gives that kind of thing an almost painting look, like it's a
Yes.
greenness that doesn't make it mucky or ugly, but rather that nature itself is beautiful, even if it's on our bodies, which is great. I love it.
Well, and in fact, Cookie brings more of that nature onto his body in person. He buys those boots toward the beginning and is really embarrassed when people notice them and comment on them. And I think he's probably afraid it'll lead to some sort of trouble. So after having cleaned them, he muddies them up.
Yeah.
And he finds safety in that in nature, when most people would have said it was safer to be inside the fort, that was the town. But that's where he's comfortable. Joan, you have a question or comment?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I just have a comment. I saw the cow as their unicorn, and a unicorn is symbolic and represents freedom, hope, good luck. And to me, that's what the cow represented.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's, clearly they had significant plans, really that relied heavily on that cow's milk. And that was, of course, their brilliance to utilize this thing nobody else really knew what to do with too much, but also that was their fatal flaw, of course, because it wasn't theirs and it could disappear at any time. But yeah, one of the great things about it, and the great thing about it being an animal, and a relatively inexpressive animal rather than a person or a dog or something like that, is that it's this vessel that lends itself to these different interpretations, both for people within the film and for us as viewers, right? Because the chief found it to be a sign of civilization, right? A marker of culture, the high culture that he was trying to recreate there. They saw it as a competitive advantage in their business plans. And then there's everything that we've talked about seeing it as and more. Jennifer, do you have any thoughts?
I just think that's a really interesting idea that it would be a unicorn, because of course unicorns don't exist. So this is an impossible animal in this space, but also maybe their flaw was believing in it too much, right? Having too much faith in an impossibility. And yet at the same time, without it, we'd have no plot. So one needs the unicorn, I suppose.
Janice, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I was very interested in the character of Cookie. He was such a sensitive human being, and he related so beautifully to nature. And I had the feeling that he would never have chosen to be among these rough people necessarily. There were a number of times that he was chastised, or people were
Threatening him.
Yes,
Yeah.
right, threatening him, and he would go back to nature again. And when we learned a little bit about him, you could see that he just ended up in this situation. And I was very interested in how his life changed after he made his friend and how that relationship developed. I thought it was really a very beautiful relationship. And I think they were probably filming differently when he was in the forest than, for instance, when it was in the town. You just had a whole different feeling. That feeling was retained in their home as far as how it was photographed, but not, for instance, when they were around the fire and they were being threatened, and he was being threatened, Cookie, or even in the town. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Janice. Well, one difference I think in between those settings is a difference in light. The light available in those settings. The forest is obviously dense and has limited light. The town or the fort area has been cleared, sort of almost by definition. So it's a much brighter place. Their home as well is dimly lit. I think one thing that I don't know enough about the production to say they only shot with available light. I kind of doubt they did, especially in the woods at night, but they gave the appearance sort of like what we saw in Days of Heaven, of only using the light that would have been available at the time. But then of course it's a different environment in the chief's house, because it's a wealthier house. So he has more windows, bigger windows, it's painted white inside. So I think there is something there to the light related to certain locations over others, and the affinity the characters have for it. Jennifer, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think those are great comments. Reich talks about in an interview how she used a lot of day for night shooting in the woods, which is an approach where you shoot in the daytime and then put a filter of some kind in post-production to make it look like night, or in the old days, you put something over the lens to make it look like it was nighttime, which might lend that kind of almost eerie, ethereal feeling to the wood shots that you noticed. I also think, and I don't sit around with a clicker like some people in Andrew and my field do and time the shots, but to me it seemed like the shots in the fort were much shorter than the ones that were taking place in the forest, or certainly in the cabin, where we have a lot of time to just look at the two men together without the camera moving or trying to tell us anything important other than this is the relation. Whereas in the fort, we're looking at, what's that guy doing? Oh, she's carrying water. What's she carrying that dirty water around? These kinds of questions swirl in our mind. They don't when we're looking at the two men together. But to go to your first comment, which I thought was so fantastic, that Cookie wouldn't have wanted to be with these people necessarily, these fur trappers at the beginning, or these kind of rough men in the fort. I think you're right. And this is something that Reich does in a lot of her films, where we're looking at characters who have just kind of ended up in this place because they're searching for something, but we never know exactly what they're searching for. Like, what does Cookie actually want? He wants to open this hotel somewhere, but in San Francisco, or how is he going to achieve that? There's not really a plan. And this is something that's characteristic of the way that she's building sympathetic characters. We look into their interiority by seeing what it is they do with their habits in order to think about who they are, but they're not going to achieve a goal because there's kind of no way forward there. They've ended up someplace.
Let's see. Lee, do you have a question or comment?
I wanted to go back to the cow a little bit. I also thought of the cow as another kind of nature, and the milk as a natural resource, the same way that he was always picking berries or picking flowers or knowing how to use things that were available in nature. And but also they were, in a way, particularly King Louis, very entrepreneurial and wanting to have more and more and more. And King Louis didn't have enough sense not to stop over milking the cow. So there was sort of a capitalist dream, even within what was going on with the pair of them. And I thought that added to the universality of the movie. Maybe people don't agree, but.
No, yeah, that's great.
No, thank you, Lee. Jennifer and I were talking about this topic a little bit before we came on, and Jennifer, could you mention what you pointed out to me?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right to point to the entrepreneurial spirit. King Louis definitely has that and talks about why that would be a positive thing for them to be able to achieve this. But as you pointed out, they're trying to achieve it by using nature too much, right? He doesn't know when to stop. And I think that Reichardt, because she does this, she makes this kind of commentary a lot in her work too. But if you remember the beginning of the film, it starts with this quote from William Blake: "A bird, a nest, the spider, a web, man, friendship." And as we watch, it becomes very clear, okay, friendship is the thing that nurtures and keeps men safe. That's a wonderful commentary. But of course, William Blake also wrote poems in which we're looking at the way that capitalism can really destroy a city such that we have no experience with nature anymore. So my colleagues and I this morning at Ursinus, we were talking about Blake's London, which begins, "I wandered through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet, mark of weakness, marks of woe." So it wears us down, this effort to continually sustain ourselves in a community where we have destroyed nature. So in other words, I think her use of Blake is on purpose, not just to highlight the idea of friendship, but also as a commentary on what we've done to ourselves by destroying our natural world and trying to build up a capitalist one.
I also think it's interesting because you mentioned in your introduction that the movie opens in the present day,
Yeah,
and that there is there has to be a reason for that, right? I mean, one of the things I always try to think about when I watch a film, and I always encourage people to think about, is where does the story begin? Where does the story end? That tells you something. And also, filmmakers are constantly making choices. One of the biggest choices they make, in general terms, is what to show us, right? So there's no reason that the film had to start in the present day. It doesn't appear to shed any light on what happens in the past. So then the question is why? And I have some ideas. I'm wondering if other people do. That was one of the things Jennifer encouraged us to think about. To me, and this may be kind of out there, so I'll just say it because I don't think I'm going to steal anyone's thunder. I really sort of got a 2001 A Space Odyssey vibe, kind of almost like in reverse, that the 2001 has those segments in the beginning of the sort of prehistoric rise of man, and the connection is made between those early humanoids learning to use tools, and then in 2001 people using spaceships and satellites and all this stuff. But the point still being, though, that tools are tools. One of the points being that tools are tools, and the tools may be different, but human nature isn't really all that different. And I sort of got that here as well, that we see a tanker ship. I don't know if it's a tanker or a freight ship, but it's a big ship that is clearly transporting goods from somewhere else to that area, just as the cow was transported in. And it's not a single cow anymore. It's things that are different and bigger and probably from farther away, but that hasn't changed. And that's the connection I made in seeing that. If you don't have anything to add right now, Jennifer, we can see what some other folks have to say.
I have something to say, but let's hear what they have to say first.
Okay, sounds good. Diane, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not going to respond to that, Andrew, but
That's
I
okay.
wanted to talk about the women in the film. So I think I'd seen the movie several weeks ago, but if I remember correctly, it is a woman who finds the remains at the very beginning. But in terms of the general movie, so there was a young girl that was carrying milk, and there were times when I was worried about her, that there'd be an attack on her, but that didn't happen. And then there was the wealthy man's wife, who sits down for a conversation with the Native American woman. But they're certainly in the background. But if you could comment on how you think the women play a role in this story, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that you're right to point to these scenarios where we think that girl, I agree with you completely, and she's wearing a red dress, so she seems vulnerable in the frame and she stands out, and we think, oh no, is she going to drop the pail? Is somebody going to hurt her? And they don't, right, as you said. And I think that what she's giving us glimpses of is there's a whole other community behind this scene that she's focusing on, and that everything that's happening with the women that we see talking on the sofa, or with the little girl, or with the woman in the present digging with her hands, could be its own story. But this is the story we're looking at. But by giving us glimpses of those women, their stories, at least to me as a viewer, become equally important. And Reichert usually makes films about women, well, not always, but there are a few films in which she really foregrounds women, Certain Women, Wendy and Lucy, Meek's Cut Off. So we're used to seeing Reichert tell stories about women, and it's almost as if they're glimpses of her other films lingering in the background, knowing that these communities could be foregrounded, but they just aren't in this particular instance. To speak about the woman at the beginning that you pointed out, what struck me so much about watching it the second time was that she digs so furiously at those bones with her hands. Why? I mean, this is a question I don't know the answer to. Why does she take such an effort to unearth the entirety of the two skeletons, all of it, with her hands in that moment, and then sits back, and then we move to the past? I don't know the answer to that. At first I thought maybe it's an image of Reichert herself trying to unearth the past, using the tools, as Andrew was pointing to, tools of her trade, filmmaking, but I'm not really sure that it's that simple. So anyway.
I read a review of this movie by, I think it was A.O. Scott, and he said that Alia Shawkat was in an earlier film of Reichert's? Was she, I think she was in, yeah, and he sort of said that it was Reichert's way of sort of setting this in Reichert's universe. I don't know if he's seen too many Marvel movies or something, but so I don't know, but I do agree with you. I mean, you know, she presents in a way, you know, it's funny in a way. I hadn't thought of this, but there are elements of this movie that kind of remind me of some of the Coen brothers' work. One, because they also make sort of very historically and regionally specific movies, and seem to have this great understanding of the setting and pay a lot more attention to and respect to the settings than a lot of other filmmakers. And it seems like Reichert does that. But the other thing too is, in those movies, like in this movie, you see so many characters where you'd be willing to at least watch, if not just a half-hour detour about, you know, the guy with the raven, or the person with the boat with the dog on the front of the boat, you know. And you see that in Coen Brothers movies. These characters who are introduced, you think they're so interesting and they are presented so boldly. They must have something to do with the larger story, but then they don't. That's just this world. And we see, I saw that in this movie today, and it's to me it suggests there are a lot of things in this movie that said to me that Reichert was a confident filmmaker and a filmmaker who has tremendous respect for her audience, which I find to be in rather short supply in American filmmaking by and large. And I think that's an element of that. I can introduce something. I can give you more than you need, and I can give you less than a lot of other filmmakers think you need, and you will be able to, follow what I'm saying and engage with the film in at least partly the way I hope you will. And I think that's refreshing, if nothing else. Lee, you have a question or comment?
It sort of moved on from where it was, but I think that you're emphasizing something that the other leader emphasized in the beginning, which is the lingering of the camera, and the way the way she stays with that woman. It sets up the importance of what she's finding, and then there's the sort of, all of a sudden there's a revelation of not just one skull and some ribs, but two entire skeletons. It leads you into the story, I think, in a very atypical but very seductive way.
Yeah, I went back and forth on whether it, and I'd be curious to know your thoughts on this, Jennifer. I went back and forth on whether knowing about those skeletons made the film more suspenseful or less suspenseful in a way. What did you think?
To me, it's connected to the question of lingering that Lee just brought up. It's not, to me, about what happens or the service of characters to a story or a narrative moving forward. It's about thinking about the relation of people in an environment and what could be and what could have been. So I like the choice because it doesn't allow us to think that they're gonna succeed and then they failed. It's not like people are going on a quest and then it falls apart, or then they're going on a quest and then they succeed in their quest and all the other characters are in service of the fulfillment of this quest. Instead, we're being asked to dissolve that kind of momentum and really sit with the question of what could be. How could our society have been different if there were more men like these two? That's what I keep asking myself. Or if we had decided to praise men like these two, or if we had decided to endorse William Blake's idea about the world, what the world should look like.
So you raise an interesting point, because someone in the chat was saying, everybody don't forget that these two guys were stealing, and they were stealing a scarce resource that wasn't theirs. And granted, they were stealing from, a pompous, rich politician, but they were still stealing. And is that any sort of, we also don't know, the truth about, we have no reason to doubt it necessarily, just like we have no reason to doubt Cookie's background, but we don't really know that these men came to be in the places they are via the means they said they did. So I think it's a fair question. You just said, Jennifer, more men like these, but I mean, at the very least, they were thieves. And I'm sure you have a good response for why we should still, be encouraged if we had a world with more men like them. So what is it?
Oh, the land was stolen too. That's why we see all of the indigenous people around all of the time. I think it's a reminder that this land shouldn't have belonged to chief actor to begin with. And we could have imagined a way in which, I don't know, in the best scenario, I guess drifters coexist, but in a better scenario, maybe the land is left to be treated like it ought to be instead of colonized. So.
Okay. So, sort of what goes around comes around kind of thing, right?
Maybe other people have an opinion about that.
Let's see. JD, you have a question or comment?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I guess what parallels from there to the present is that does the punishment fit the crime? Because these guys were stealing milk and were broke and trying to get a leg up. And that maybe somewhat parallels what happens to lower class or poor folks in today's time with crime and punishment versus rich guys' crime and punishment.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's another theme that Reich has in her films too. People are always struggling to be able to achieve what they want to achieve against a system that's blocking them. But also, they stole the milk and they knew what to do with it. Chief Factor didn't know what to do with his cow. He didn't even understand why it wasn't giving enough milk. He doesn't understand how to treat an animal or how to treat nature. And so by having them know how to use that milk to make delicious oily cakes, we're more sympathetic towards them and their experience, I think.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting because I sort of seem to have this impression, and I thought that the chief mentioned this at one point, that it's not proper for British people to put milk in their tea, and he sort of thought it was kind of funny that that captain did that, and so he's kind of using this incredibly scarce resource for this thing that he doesn't even consider to be entirely legitimate. That's all he can use it for. And these men are bringing all this joy to dozens of people. So I certainly see that. But yeah, I mean, it as someone was saying in the chat, that, I mean, they were trying to kill those guys, and that would have been seen as a really, really serious crime at the time, I'm sure.
I feel like John's comment in the chat saying, he says this is the lawless frontier, is important too, because in the context of a Western, what is good doesn't always correspond to what is lawful, right?
Right. And I think that's another interesting thing, because I think it's important that we keep in mind that this film is a Western, and that it in some ways departs from sort of standard visions of Westerns in some ways. But if you think about the core themes that Westerns, that the genre is supposed to have at its heart, this film really, really embraces those and really explores those. Even though it doesn't have many of the sort of tropes we tend to think of as being part of that genre, it really, really engages with it.
Can I also just say, someone in the chat also just posted, it's like stealing cattle. And if you think about that, if you think about a film like Red River, where John Wayne brands the other guy's cattle, and then he just shoots the other guy when he comes over to try to take his cattle back. That's also a kind of thing that happens in the Western. John Wayne and his team were, for a while in that film anyway, the good guys, and they stole cattle, and that was all right because they were the stronger dudes. And in a way, Reichert is taking that same kind of trope and saying, okay, here's not the stronger guys who know what to do with the stolen thing, it's the guys who understand how that object works and how to make a better world with it. It's not might, it's a sympathy with the environment. Change in value system, I guess, but the same move.
I mean, it's a sympathy with an environment, or it's an intelligence, right? It's knowledge, and it's a change in the hierarchy, whether it's what you said or what I said, right? That's not what the genre typically recognizes, and that's not what our conception of that time typically valued, or at least what achieved primacy during that time. So that is very a very important departure. We seem to be out of questions or comments. So if there's just one or two more things that we could talk about, Jennifer, if you don't mind. I was really, really struck about how much this movie was about friendship, and how brilliantly it depicted the friendship. And I feel like a real sort of sincere and serious exploration of friendship between women or between men are things that movies tend not to focus on. And I feel like this one did, between these two men. And I thought that was wonderful. That friendship is something that Reichert is interested in, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. In Wendy and Lucy, it's about there's a friendship between a woman and her dog, but also she makes a friend with a security guard at a pharmacy, for example. And so you're thinking a lot about what is our relations to each other based on? What do we owe each other? And throughout the film, if you notice the Blake story at the beginning, you're thinking a lot to yourself about, is friendship really what we need to keep us safe? I mean, that's what a nest and a web do. It provides us a home and it gives us safety. And in this film, we have a home when the two men become friends together. It is a little bit like their nest or their web in the cabin in the woods. So I think you're totally right to point to the idea of friendship as the key aspect of the film and something that does seem to be missing. Someone in the chat just pointed out Midnight Cowboy. I agree with that as another wonderful movie about friendship. Midnight Cowboy is beautiful.
So we're due one every 50 years or so, right? I mean,
I
mean that's actually, I mean, it's actually like, one of the refreshing things. I know you've thought about this and talked about this. It's one of the refreshing things about Die Hard, those moments of friendship between Bruce Willis and Al Powell. And but usually if you're going to see it in an American film, it's between, terrorists being killed and bombs going off. And it was just refreshing here to see it, unravel at its own sort of pace and to sort of, end up in this sort of natural depiction. The other thing I found interesting is the way we see their friendship bud is at King's home. And King says, I'll make a fire. And he goes out and starts doing the wood. And Cookie looks around and sort of thinks to himself, what can I do? Right? And starts doing those things. And it's in a way, it foretells their business relationship, right? That they each have these areas of knowledge and skill and responsibility. And if they hadn't found each other and each found a person with a complementary set of skills, one who knows how to sell a product, the other one who knows how to actually make a desired product, that their partnership wouldn't have worked. And I thought it was really interesting in a film that, to my mind, is at least being somewhat critical of capitalism, to sort of show the friendship develop in a comparable way. I thought was a very interesting choice.
Yeah, I almost don't even know what to say about that scene. It's so beautiful. I love it so much, where we're looking at one out the window and the other one sweeping in the doorway. He automatically just begins doing those things without being asked to. And then when he goes and finds the wildflowers from the woods and puts it in a vase, and King Lear comes back and says, it's looking better already. It's just, I can't find words for what that is. It's cinematic poetry, I suppose, that moment of rhythm and friendship. Yeah, absolutely. It also brings back to something that somebody said at the very beginning about the end of the film, when King Lear at the very end looks at the bag and realizes that he could go on, that Cookie is lying there unconscious and he could just carry on. And instead, what does he say? I got you, something like that. I think those are the last words of the film. Maybe someone can remind us. Do you think he was making a choice there, knowing that they were going to die in those woods? Or did he really think that they would carry on from that moment? That's something I don't know.
I think he thought they would carry on. I think he was thinking about, I have the money, I'm conscious, I could leave with it, but I'm not going to do that to this guy. I think he thought they were, relatively safe. I don't think he would have allowed himself to go to sleep if he didn't think that. But he didn't see that guy stalking them like we did. The other thing I thought was interesting is, I would just say to all the people out there who are listening who are in a serious long-term sort of partner-like relationship, whether it's marriage or whatever, think about the things you do in your household and the thing your partner does in your household, the things your partner does in your household, and the extent to which how few of those things you actually discussed, right? A lot of those things you fall into doing, right? You fall into doing because you know the other person really hates it, or the other person knows you're better at it, or it's similar to this thing you're already doing, or whatever. And that's what I love. That's what rang true to me so much about that scene we were talking about in the cabin, that nobody said, told Cookie what to do. He just sort of thought, okay, what can I do here? And just kind of started doing it. And then you see in the subsequent scenes, all the things they're doing sort of develop that way, which just seemed to me to be very organic and very authentic.
There's a way in which we sometimes, Andrew, I know we both know this, talk about films as a product of their mode of production. In other words, the way the films are produced comes out in the films themselves. And what you were just saying about partnership is also part of this filmmaking process. So I shot 2 versions of that introduction, and then I got really, really cold. And in one of them, I mentioned John Raymond, and the other one I forgot. And John Raymond is the guy who wrote the novel this is based on, and he writes screenplays with Kelly Reichardt really commonly, either by writing the short story at the beginning that she bases the film on, but they work together in partnership, and it developed in this same kind of way, or one of them is the writer and the other is the filmmaker, but they're both continually commenting on each other's work as it's progressing. And so it's almost as if that theme that you identify where people fall into place in the work that they do domestically happened with the production of the film.
That's really interesting. David, you have a comment or question?
Yeah, in the earlier comment, Jennifer, about I'm not sure which of you it was now, about the Coen brother type scene. There were 2 scenes that I thought were vignettes, one of which I didn't understand, and the other I thought was simply sitting there as a very short people study. The one with the really big guy who was being badgered in the bar, and then he leaves the baby and he walks out into the fights, and then the 2 of them end up, after they're getting together and saying, well, let's just go to my place for a drink, and what about the baby? And they leave the baby there. And I just thought I was waiting, like the Coen brothers, I guess, to see some version of that come back, and unless I missed it, we never saw anything of that. And the other scene that Janice and I were a tiny bit perplexed about, I guess, is when King comes back and takes the money out of the tree, and he's then sort of wandering locally to their house, and then I just lost the other guy's name, comes back to the ramshacked house, and Cookie, and then they meet up again, and there's no discussion between them about the fact that the money is not in the tree, that King has got the money. No discussion, was he going to take off with it? Wasn't he? Did he think Cookie was dead, et cetera, et cetera? And that one sort of is, in some respects, unresolved, yet the fact that they just continued together at one level, I guess, implies the extreme trust of friendship. So you can comment on either or both, and just more observations about this very interesting study.
Well, thanks, David. I will say that if this movie were somehow made by the Coen brothers, obviously that man in the bar with a baby would have been John Goodman, right? You can just picture him with the patch and the white suit like he has in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, getting off the bar. Okay, I have to go take care of something, watch my baby, and then going to do it. I agree with you. That was a moment that is exactly the type of moment I was trying to make reference to. Regarding your second point, I think that, I think you came around to the perspective on it that I sort of agree with, or I would take, which is that, these 2 trust each other, and either he doesn't need to ask him, hey, what'd you do with the money? Or he knows that asking him would be very insulting, and he needs him and doesn't want to hurt him. And that what's important is that he's there and he has it, and now they're back together. Jennifer?
I love the baby scene because it's so confusing, as you pointed out. I mean, it brings all kind of memories for me. I remember when my kids were babies and I just wanted a drink. And like that guy goes to the bar and he just wants a drink. Like, okay, he's got this baby, but man, you know, and then somebody has to go and attack him. And instead of hold my beer, it's hold my baby. There it stays there. But I think that somebody in the chat had mentioned earlier that is this some kind of feminist view about men doing domestic tasks? And if it were, that would be the scene, that would be it. Like it's the guy that brings that baby to the bar. Where's the mom of this baby? I don't know. And Reich doesn't feel the need to point it out because maybe men can just watch the baby for once. And that seems to be a suggestion that's going on in that moment. But I agree with your connection, both of your connection to the Coen brothers. It's fantastic.
Liz, you have a question or comment?
I think that from the first moment the two men were together and they were sleeping, they became friends and trusted each other without really seeing each other. It was so dark in there. And then when they came out, they were almost already friends. And I thought that that was an interesting idea to work through the movie.
That's beautiful. I'm so glad you I had almost forgotten how they met in the woods in this way where one of them is just so terribly vulnerable and Cookie helps him out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's again pointing back to that, what makes us human has to be in some way our ability to recognize another's humanity. And in this case, that the humanity of another person who's a different ethnicity or race than we are is equivalent to our own. And I think we're seeing that both of these men are outsiders to this community. They're not from this area of the world. And by recognizing another's humanity in that moment, they become friends or they become bonded in some way in order to move forward in a kind of world where they're not from. And you're right to bring us back to that point. I think that you're exactly right, that's the moment where they become friends. It wasn't about talking, it was about being human together in a space that is often hostile to humans.
And just the two of them just have, I mean, I don't know another way to put it. They just seem so much more civilized than the pack of trappers that we'd seen Cookie with up to that point. I mean, it was just, it's like you could imagine, like if talking about kids, like you bring your kid to a play date and there's to a kid's birthday party, and there's like 20 3-year-olds there and there's one other adult. You're going to talk to that one other adult no matter what, because you need something to take your ears and eyes and mind off those 23-year-olds, or else I'm just the worst dad ever. I'm not sure which it is. Let's see, Janice, you have a question or comment?
Yes, going back for a moment to that baby scene, that was fairly early in the movie and before anything had started about the cow. And you know how sometimes you sort of expect the movie to go in a certain direction. And it appeared to me at that point that Cookie was going to get stuck with the baby and that's where the cow was going to come in. That it was going to end up being about him finding a way to feed this child. Obviously, it didn't go that way, but that's what I imagined.
I could see that. I could totally see that. Lee, you have a question or comment? Okay. Joss, did you have another question or comment?
Yeah.
I'm muted now. Go ahead. Go ahead, Joss.
Okay. I wondered about if there's any other significance to the oily cakes other than the means of doing business, but they almost took on this sort of magical characteristic. People projected on them their memories of, somebody said, this is like my mother used to make, and Chief said, oh, this is like England or London or Paris. And it just seemed like people were making out of these little confections something greater. Just wondered if there were any thoughts about that.
I have one, but Jennifer, if you want to go first.
I think that's a great comment. I mean, there's two things I have to say about it. One, that the oily cakes, she tried to find something that would be authentically from the period and rare. So she learned a lot about the history of donuts in order to find out that oily cakes were pre-donuts, but tasted kind of similar, and then found out that they could have been made at that time in this place in this way. But I think you're totally right to point it to the idea that food brings us memories, this kind of Proustian notion. And in that comment, it reminds me then of a number of other films that make that same move, like Babette's Feast, where the food is very important because it's from France in that movie. And then she brings it to Jutland in Denmark and allows people to have this kind of experience with a taste that's reminiscent for her of her culture. There's a series of food films I think we could put this into and think about it in that context.
The other thing I would say, and I if it has any merit, I can't take credit for it. I think I read it in A.O. Scott's review of the movie, is that one thing those cakes remind us of is of how essential to human contentment, if not existence, a luxury is. Doesn't matter what the luxury is. How we define a luxury is all relative. But talk about a connection in this movie to the here and now. Think about the things in the last 10 months you've been excited about or you've looked forward to that in the prior to last March, you would have thought either were a burden or were nothing special at all. I mean, I can think of so many things that are a departure, are an escape, are a luxury, are a treat now that in the past I took for granted or viewed as a burden. And the way we see those people acting is a representation of what any luxury can do to or any treat can do to the human spirit. And I found it to be both a very, very intense reaction, but also a completely, understandable one given the circumstances.
That's gorgeous. I'm glad you said that. Really beautiful.
Thanks. Reena, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I think that, if you look at this film, the mothers are all absent. So Cookie's mother died when he was born. The little girl is going along. She doesn't have a parent. That baby doesn't have a mother. And, instead of mother's milk, you've got cow's milk. So that the fact that it's milk and that it's being used to nurture the nostalgia of each person, within it's being used within the cakes to do that. And the, whatever his name is, the mayor, the captain, the general, he totally misses the boat because for him, the use of the cow is like to sort of, paint him as a certain kind of person, to impress his high-ranking guest. It has nothing to do with the nurturing powers of milk. But Cookie gets that, and he understands, and that's why he comes up with these cakes, and they have to be a cake with a certain taste. Like the other guy says, it tastes like my mother's. And so he's tuning into something that is just as essential for human life, like you were saying, Andrew, or even more essential, I would say, to human life than what all the other people think is essential to civilized life, to human life.
Yeah, it's not a status, it's how it makes us feel and what it makes us remember and the safety that it gives us. I think that's stunning, really fantastic.
Yeah, that was a really great point. Lee, did you have another comment or question?
It was, again, going back to the ending. I think that they both were stumbling around looking for the other one. I believe that Cookie was injured. I think he had been shot. Now, I may be wrong about that, but he was so weak that I wondered if he hadn't been injured, but they wander around and go back to the house and then they find each other. But I thought that Cookie was too weak to deal with the money. He was still trying to get away from the people who were pursuing him.
No, I
Friend was the one who was compass menace enough at that point to deal with the money.
No, I think that's a good point, Lee. He fell when he was running through the woods. He fell and hit his head, and that was obviously a serious injury because it impaired him for the rest of the film. And I think you're right. I think he probably it wasn't foremost on his mind. I don't know that the money was ever foremost on his mind. It certainly seemed to be a bigger element of King's interest in the endeavor than Cookie's, though Cookie was interested too. So I think that's a good point.
I mean, it's another one of those moments where we never find out much about the person who was nurturing him or who allowed him to stay in that home where he was, lying there. It reminded me a lot of Never Cry Wolf, another movie about nature and our encroachment on it.
Robert, you have a question or comment?
Oh, yes. Jennifer, I thought your comment was so interesting when you talked about an immobile camera. Yeah. What I was wondering is if in the field of cinematography, do we want to give variety to the cinematographic techniques, like maybe having a mobile camera, but also having a camera that moves, having angles that are high angles and angles that are low angles, and also varying the length of the shots? Or is that sort of what a great cinematographer will do, is combine the techniques rather than just doing one? Or what do you think? Variety.
I think we understand what you're asking, Robert. Jennifer, you had pointed out a little bit about the cinematography, and I guess Robert's trying to get a sense of what dictates the toolbox a cinematographer would tend to use.
I think it depends on what you're trying to say. So there are some directors that shoot for coverage so that later in the editing process, you can make a decision to have a conversation with shot, reverse shot, because you've got all those shots in your toolbox, and you've got a long shot and you can go back and forth between these things and edit in a more traditional way. And Reichert doesn't really do that. She doesn't do it for a couple of reasons. One, she doesn't have enough money to do a whole lot of coverage shots. And the second reason she doesn't do it is she's very deliberately making a choice to ask us to slow down and contemplate what it is we're looking at. And the slow, immobile shooting in the forest and the cabin are part of a tradition of filmmaking that we tend to refer to now as slow cinema. She's not the only person to do this, and there are a number of other films that work like this too. But you have to think about people coming in and out of the frame, and what does movement of our bodies tell us about who we are and how we've been trained and the time that we live in. So in the introduction, I also pointed out that she trains her actors to do the kind of chores. She calls them chores. She's very interested in chores. And so that every time Cookie milked the cow, he was really milking the cow. It was very important to her that her humans have relationships with the animals that they're interacting with in her films, and that we're watching real interactions and real activities with our bodies. And if you're always cutting, we're not really seeing that. Instead, we're seeing a filmmaker's vision of what we're meant to be looking at. We recognize more a narrator's position. And that's why I pointed out when we're in Chief Factor's house, she does move the camera quite a lot in an almost irrelevant way, spinning around that room for almost, I don't know why she did that. We see the entirety of the room while the two men are having a conversation. And then later on, she pans across and back again, almost like that shot at the end of the conversation, and dude is playing a saxophone there and the camera's just moving all around. It's disconnected from the space, because in that moment, we're not seeing people authentically in tune with their bodies and with each other doing chores. Instead, we're seeing them, at least this is my interpretation, enacting social positions. And so it's like the camera doesn't want us to be drawn to that, it seems to me. So I think she's doing a lot of things with that choice for the immobile camera and then the movement in the house. And the reason is that we can see so
Thanks,
much.
Jennifer. And thanks for the question, Robert.
Would you say, may I just ask one more?
Okay.
Would you say that French cinema I'm not sure if I could name, maybe Renoir, for example, tends, or maybe European cinema tends to be more slow with more.
I don't think you can make that that sweeping of a generalization. I think, for example, one of the things that jumps out at people about the French New Wave is it was much more energetic, much more
like Breathless.
Yes, much more of a rapid, almost guerrilla style approach to filming and editing than what Hollywood was doing at the time. So it varies from movement, and thoughtful filmmakers are making these choices, as Jennifer was discussing, in relationship to their content and to the story they're trying to tell and the way they're trying to tell it. And if they're not doing that, if they're not thinking about those things, it's either because they're not very good filmmakers, or that's not the story and the characters aren't the most important thing. I think about action films, I think about superhero films, and by and large, they have different directives than to, really make sure the themes hit home and the characters' journeys hit home. Some of them are that thoughtful, but many of them aren't, and they're shot and edited accordingly. Well, that was a bit of a detour, but one that was related to the film that I hope you all found as interesting as I did. And I found it so interesting in part because of Jennifer's introduction and her comments. Jennifer, thank you so much for suggesting the film and for making another wonderful introduction.
Thank you. And thank all of you for all your wonderful comments too. That was such a wonderful set of thoughts for me to have as well after talking to you. I feel so much differently about the film actually, so thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we really got a lot of great perspectives. I mean, we usually do, but I think they were really, really instructive about today's film in particular. We do have a number of upcoming seminars. Our Tuesday night remote classroom is coming back next week. There are still some spots left in Paul Wright's seminar on the films of Jordan Peele, though it does have a very healthy enrollment, so I wouldn't wait too long before signing up. We have a seminar, as you can see, coming up on Macbeth, different iterations of Macbeth on film. And then we have two seminars on Fritz Lang, one that introduces us to his work in German cinema, where he first gained notoriety, and another that looks at his work in Hollywood. In addition, we have another visit from Gary Kramer and his focus on short films in short attention span theater. That was a TV show, short attention span cinema. All of the films he'll be looking at next time are directed by women. And then I will be doing a seminar shortly before the Oscars, which are being held late this year in April, about the Oscars. So that's what we have coming up there. But of course, we will be back on Monday for another discussion, as we are most Mondays. Please visit brynmarfilm.org, check out Theater 5, where we have new films you can only see through the theater. And also check out Film Studies Online, where you'll see what else we have going on, including our Ask Andrew mini lessons, and of course a library of all of our discussions, many of which were done by and feature a wonderfully creative video by Jennifer. So if you are relatively new to our group here, you have a lot to catch up on, and they're all can be found there. And you should sign up for our emails. Every Thursday we announce what the following Monday's film will be. We give some information about it and link to one of the moderators' video introductions for it. So we hope you will sign up for that as well. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you for your support with both your time, your engagement, your focus, and when appropriate, your donations. My colleagues and I were all very, very appreciative of how much so many of you were able to donate in our end of the year campaign, and we greatly appreciate it. Thank you. And if you're new to us and you like what we're doing and you haven't made a donation, maybe you can. We would appreciate whatever amount you can give to keep us going until we're able to reopen. So thank you very much, everybody, and I will see you next week, and Jennifer will be back with us before too long. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night, all. Thank you.